Most people think having no friends is a sign that something is wrong with you. But watch carefully. The strange thing about human nature is that the people who spend the most time alone are often the ones who see reality more clearly than everyone else. Have you ever wondered why some people slowly disconnect from almost everybody around them? Not because they hate people, not because they're incapable of socializing, but because, with time, they begin to notice things others prefer to ignore. The hidden competition behind kindness, the exhausting performances inside conversations, the invisible pressure to constantly belong. And once someone truly sees these dynamics, it becomes difficult to return to superficial connections.
I am the watcher, and here, in Shadow Insight, we observe the hidden mechanisms behind human behavior. Today, you will discover why some people with no friends often possess traits that are surprisingly rare in modern society. Traits most people secretly admire, but often reject when they encounter them in real life. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: society claims to value authenticity until someone actually becomes impossible to manipulate. And by the end of this video, you may realize that loneliness is not always a social failure. Sometimes, it is the psychological cost of seeing too much. If this kind of psychological insight interests you, subscribe to Shadow Insight and tell me in the comments, do you think solitude changes people or simply reveals who they already were? Have you ever noticed that people who spend a lot of time alone often notice things others completely miss? Small reactions, changes in tone, forced smiles, moments of discomfort, invisible tension inside ordinary conversations. Most social environments operate on distraction. People talk constantly, they feel silence immediately. They move from one interaction to another without truly observing anything. But someone who spends long periods alone develops a different relationship with human behavior. They watch, quietly. And with time, they begin to recognize patterns. They notice who only becomes friendly when others are watching, who suddenly changes personality depending on status, who pretends to listen while waiting for their turn to speak. The strange thing about people is that most of their real intentions are never spoken directly. They leak through micro behaviors, a delayed reaction, a look of irritation, a subtle shift in energy. And people who live in solitude long enough become highly sensitive to these details. This is one reason they sometimes struggle socially afterward. Because once you start seeing the performance behind certain interactions, you cannot unsee it. A simple dinner conversation no longer feels simple. You begin noticing hidden hierarchies, validation seeking, passive competition, emotional manipulation disguised as humor. And suddenly, socializing becomes mentally exhausting. Most people assume lonely individuals lack social intelligence, but in reality, many of them simply became too aware of social behavior, too aware of the masks people wear, too aware of the emotional transactions hidden inside ordinary relationships. Have you ever met someone who stayed quiet most of the time, but somehow understood everyone in the room better than the people constantly talking? Those individuals are rarely observing by accident. Solitude trains perception, because when external noise disappears, human nature becomes much easier to hear. Most people are terrified of being alone with their own thoughts. That is why they constantly search for distraction, noise, messages, conversations, attention, validation. Because silence forces people to confront themselves. And many individuals spend their entire lives avoiding that confrontation. But people who live without many friends often experience something very different. With time, they build an internal world that becomes richer than their external social life. They think deeply. They analyze constantly. They replay conversations in their minds. They question human behavior. They observe themselves as much as they observe others. And this creates a trait
that has become increasingly rare in modern society: psychological self-awareness. Jung believed that most people spend their lives hiding from the parts of themselves they feared the most. But solitude makes hiding difficult. When there is nobody constantly distracting you,
Your insecurities become louder. Your fears become visible. Your contradictions begin to surface. And although this process is uncomfortable, it often creates people with unusual emotional depth. That is why some individuals with very few friends can appear strangely calm. Not because life has been easy for them, but because they have spent years confronting their own minds. Most people only know who they are in social environments. They define themselves through reactions, approval, attention, belonging. But someone who spends long periods alone is eventually forced to answer a much more uncomfortable question. Who am I when nobody is watching? And very few people truly know the answer. The strange thing about human nature is that many friendships are built less on connection and more on mutual distraction. People help each other escape themselves. That is why silence feels unbearable to some individuals. But those who survive solitude often develop a powerful ability. They become emotionally independent. Not completely emotionless, not cold, but less dependent on external validation to feel valuable. And modern society rarely produces people like that anymore. Because a person who is comfortable alone becomes much harder to influence, much harder to pressure, much harder to control. And whether people admit it or not, that kind of independence unsettles others. At first, most people think loneliness comes from rejection. But with time, you begin to notice something far more unsettling. Some people are not alone because nobody wants them around. They are alone because they slowly lost the ability to tolerate fake connections. Have you ever wondered why certain individuals suddenly disappear from social circles without explanation? No dramatic conflict, no public argument. They simply become distant, quiet, unavailable, almost as if they became exhausted by human interaction itself. But the real reason is often deeper. The more someone observes people, the harder it becomes to ignore the invisible games hidden inside relationships. Freud once observed that human beings are not nearly as rational as they pretend to be. And nowhere is this more visible than in social dynamics. Many friendships are built on silent contracts, validation in exchange for loyalty, attention in exchange for conformity, presence in exchange for emotional submission. Most people never consciously realize this, but they feel it. That subtle pressure to remain the same version of themselves so others stay comfortable. And individuals who spend a long time alone often become highly sensitive to these hidden expectations. They notice how some people only support confidence when it remains non-threatening, how honesty is praised until it becomes inconvenient, how authenticity is admired until it disrupts group harmony. The strange thing about people is that they often say they want real individuals around them, but in reality, most social groups function through unwritten performances, predictability, emotional diplomacy, controlled honesty. And once someone loses interest in performing constantly, they begin drifting away from many relationships naturally. This is why certain lonely individuals appear emotionally detached, not because they stop caring, but because repeated disappointment changed the way they see human connection. After enough experiences, they stop asking, "Who likes me?" and start asking, "Who feels real when nobody benefits from pretending?" That question changes everything, because very few relationships survive once someone begins searching for sincerity instead of social comfort. And this is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Sometimes solitude is not created by social failure. Sometimes it is created by psychological intolerance for artificial relationships. The final trait is the one people almost never talk about openly, because this trait changes the entire balance of human relationships. People who spend a long time alone often become extremely difficult to manipulate. Not immediately, not consciously, but gradually. Because solitude teaches something most social environments constantly suppress: how to exist without constant approval. And once someone no longer depends emotionally on being accepted, many traditional forms of control begin to fail. Have you ever noticed how society rewards people who are highly predictable? People who seek validation are easier to guide, easier to pressure, easier to guilt. But individuals who become emotionally comfortable alone operate differently. They are less afraid of rejection, less afraid of exclusion, less afraid of disappointing others. And that changes the entire psychological dynamic. Adler believed that many human behaviors are driven by hidden feelings of inferiority.
People seek status, recognition, belonging, not only for pleasure, but to escape feelings of weakness. And this is why social approval becomes such a powerful form of control. Most people unconsciously fear isolation, so they adapt constantly. They censor themselves. They tolerate disrespect. They hide opinions. They remain inside relationships that slowly destroy them, because being excluded feels psychologically unbearable. But someone who has already survived loneliness for years develops a dangerous realization: rejection is survivable. And once a person truly understands this, fear loses much of its power. The strange thing about human nature is that many relationships quietly depend on emotional leverage. Some people use guilt, others use silence, withdrawal, approval, attention, affection. Not always maliciously, sometimes unconsciously. But the mechanism remains the same: control through emotional dependency. And individuals who no longer desperately need social validation become harder to emotionally trap. This is why certain people appear intimidating despite being calm. Their presence unsettles others, not because they are aggressive, but because they do not react the way emotionally dependent people usually react. They can walk away, they can remain silent, they can tolerate distance. And human beings instinctively sense when someone is psychologically free. But here is the deeper truth most people never realize. Some individuals are not lonely because they failed socially. They became lonely because their minds changed in ways that made superficial attachment impossible. And after a certain point, they would rather experience solitude than perform a version of themselves just to remain accepted. The question is, how many people around you are truly connected to you, and how many are only connected to the version of you that keeps them comfortable? So, why do some people with no friends possess such rare traits? Because long periods of solitude often force people to develop abilities that modern social life slowly weakens: observation, self-awareness, emotional independence, resistance to manipulation, and a deep intolerance for superficial relationships. Most people assume loneliness automatically means something is broken, but human nature is far more complicated than that. Sometimes isolation comes from fear, sometimes from trauma, sometimes from rejection. But sometimes it emerges because a person began seeing the hidden dynamics behind human behavior too clearly to ignore them anymore. That was the truth hidden from the beginning. The rare trait was never loneliness itself. It was what solitude forced certain people to become. Because when someone spends years outside constant social validation, they often begin building an identity that no longer depends entirely on the approval of others. And society both admires and fears people like that. Admires them because they appear authentic, fears them because they become difficult to control. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable some people become around individuals who seem completely fine being alone? It is not always the solitude that disturbs them. Sometimes it is the freedom. I am the watcher, and here, in Shadow Insight, we reveal the hidden mechanisms behind human behavior. If this video made you reflect differently about solitude, leave a comment below. And subscribe to Shadow Insight for more psychological insights into the truths most people never notice. But before you leave, ask yourself this: if being alone no longer frightened you, how many people in your life would still have power over you?